by Pia Mellody.
Well, good afternoon. Well, thank you. The tape I'm going to do now, or the lecture, I originally proposed as healthy relationships, and then I decided I probably couldn't do that, and so I changed it to human relationships, which I probably could do. I have a tendency, in my cynical way, to want to call the concept healthy relationships an oxymoron, and that healthy and relationships don't fit. But of course, that's not true. That only reflects my cynicism. But I get conflicted about how to talk about relationships because it's very easy to describe an ideal. And the trouble with that is, when you listen to that kind of thing, it leads to you being disappointed when you experience your very human relationship. I believe a relationship happens whenever there's intimacy between two people. So whenever you make a decision to be physically, sexually, intellectually, or emotionally intimate with somebody, you are making a choice to be in relationship. Now, the issue here, I think, really is that in that exchange of intimacy, it can be healthy or unhealthy, or it can be toxic or it can be healthy, or it can be functional or dysfunctional. There's lots of words you can use for that. But basically, in my mind, when I think about whether an intimate moment is functional or not, I think about whether, as a result of the interaction, are the people closer together? Are they about where they started out? Or are they farther apart? Now, I think when an interaction happens and people start moving back and away, because indeed in the exchange there's been offending behavior, or because of issues of immaturity, someone or both in the partnership just simply can't stand to hear the truth, then you have something going that I think is destructive to the relationship whenever you're stepping back. It's nice, of course, if you move forward. If you stay right where you are, I think that's okay too, unless you start out here and you don't move forward. But basically, I think what's important to look at is where you're standing at the end of that experience. Now, intimacy is a real interesting concept. And basically, it's about releasing your reality towards somebody in some way or taking their reality in. In other words, I can be intimate using my own body and moving towards somebody physically or sexually, or I can also receive somebody else's body physically or sexually. Same thing with thoughts. I can speak to my thoughts or listen to somebody else's thoughts. I can share my emotions or listen to somebody else's emotions. The other thing, too, is I can simply just watch somebody. I can watch their behavior or allow somebody to watch me. All that, to me, is about being intimate. Now, the funny thing about intimacy is that it's hard to do. For us humans, it's actually in some ways hard to do, because it's about one's capacity to be vulnerable, one's capacity to be vulnerable or to be alone, or to be known. See, the thing with that is, when you talk about vulnerability, what we have to deal with when we're letting ourselves be known is somebody else's reaction to our issues of humanity or imperfection. If we have not come to accept our own issues of humanity, then we're probably going to really hide the true nature of ourselves in some way from the other person and retard the relationship or the intimate exchange. See, self-love really does enable you to make yourself vulnerable, to be known. Intimacy is also about one's capacity to give up control of the situation to a certain extent. Not complete control, because then you'd probably be in boundary failure. but certainly to give up control at some level, or to surrender to what is. Now, since you a lot of times can't predict what's going to happen, those of us who have had experience not knowing what's going to happen and then something dreadful happen will have difficulty taking the chance of letting what happen without trying to control it. So if we immediately try to start controlling it, the moment of intimacy will, unless it's about setting boundaries, the moment of intimacy will be spoiled, because if you're attempting to control somebody else's reality, you are acting in an unloving way, unless it's a statement about boundaries. Like, for example, you're touching me this way, it's hurting me, please stop touching. That's not controlling the other person, that's setting your boundaries. But if in the intimate exchange you demand that another human being be an absolute way, so they're not free to be themselves as long as they're not violating your boundaries, what you do is you retard their ability to be who they are, or their desire anyway to be with you. So it's about one's capacity to surrender to what is. It's also about one's capacity to be honest with self and others, which is directly related back to the self-esteem issue. It's directly related, and it's about one's capacity to tell the truth and stand somebody knowing the truth. You know what I've discovered about that in my relationships, especially with Pat, is that he more easily deals with me when I tell the truth. Now, I don't lie, but what I will do is not mention everything. Now, you could call that manipulation. Of course, I think there's an issue about being political within relationships. In other words, there are times when it's not in your best interest or in the relationship's long-term best interest to be revealing everything. There's something about understanding how to do that. But anyway, what I noticed in my relationship with Pat is that when I'm wanting to really hang on to something and not let him know about it, he does much better with it if I just tell him and not defend myself around that. If I just say, this is the way it is for me, and then boundary myself and allow him the space to have his reaction to that or whatever. If I allow that to happen instead of worrying about what may and then holding it, allow it to happen. He does pretty well with it. If he has upset himself about it, if I don't interfere with any of that, I just watch him. Not like a bug, but, with love in my heart. He gets almost immediately over it if he's in disagreement. He doesn't hang on to it. So when I let it go, I notice he lets it go too. Kind of works that way. And being intimate, these are all kind of interrelated actually, is about one's capacity to reach out or risk rejection. I think we have to be able to be rejected at some level in order to be in what I would call a mature relationship. So these things aren't easy. Most of us do not get help, the help we need to be in healthy relationships in the first place. Nobody's fault, I don't think. It's just the way it is. And relationships, and the nature of relationships, the values around relationships have really been changing over the last 50 years. And so we're kind of operating without any real fixed rules about it, which makes it harder to do. So what I had to do in order to make decisions as to how I was going to behave in a relationship is I focused myself around first getting into right relationship with me by learning to love myself, by focusing on having good boundaries with other people, which means I protected myself and I contained myself. I focused on being true to myself and giving some consideration to what I let out and what I kept in about myself. And I focused on probably more, really, this is really important in relationships, I started to focus on active self-care so that I wasn't so dependent. And then then I started to work on asking for help when I needed help, and only when I needed help. And in doing that, I had to also work on being willing to hear a no when I asked for help and Pat wasn't in a position to help me, or somebody else who I was in a relationship with. In other words, I not only had to learn to ask for help, which is interdependence, I had to learn to have an attitude about it. That was what my sponsor used to tell me is celebrating the no. I had to be willing to hear a no from him with an attitude of, if I hear a no from my partner, it's because he or she believes that it's in his or her best interest to do so, and that a no to me isn't rejection. It's not my partner wants to do something else. I had to work on that. I also had to work on being available to give help to another. Now that's not easy. I used to do anything anybody asked me to do, within reason. And I never considered that I should not give over, so to speak, if it was at too great a cost to me, or if it made me feel like a victim. I had to learn to discipline myself, so when somebody asked something of me, that I made a decision to think first, hey, can I do this without too great a cost to me? Can I do this without feeling like a victim and developing resentments? If the answer was yes, I'd do it. The third question I had to learn to ask myself was, can I do this without enabling this other person? If I'm doing something for them which they need to be doing for themselves, I'm enabling. So I had to learn to ask 3 questions, like that, very rapidly when somebody came and asked something of me. So I had to focus on these kinds of issues, which are around the first 4 primary symptoms. And the last thing I had to learn to do is to be moderate in all things. That was about many things, actually. That was learning how to contain myself in balance, not containing myself too tight, so I was uptight and miserable and humped over and exhausted. And also not too loosely, so that I had a tendency to put too much energy in somebody's face. But in addition to that, I had to stop such black and white thinking. Right, wrong, good, bad. There is an answer and this is it sort of attitude. I had to, in many areas of my life, learn to see that there are many solutions, that all are solutions, that there is no right or wrong answer most of the time. I had to learn to think like that, and I had to learn how to contain myself better. What is critical to really enabling a relationship to work well, I think, begins with good boundaries. If you have your personal boundaries intact, from the standpoint of protecting yourself and containing yourself both, what will happen is that you will reduce inside the relationship the amount of victimization that goes on. And that's critical. That's one issue. But the second issue is when you have good personal boundaries, you are able to, in intimate exchange, really see the other person, as well as know the self enough to be able to share that. So boundaries are critical to mature or healthy or human relationships. The other thing I think that's very important to human relationships is the ability to esteem the self. See, what most people are looking for in relationship is to be allowed to be who they are. That's what we all look for. And I think another individual has the right to be who they are within the relationship as long as they're not violating your boundaries. Most people want to be affirmed when they're being who they are, as long as it's not a boundary violation. They want to be affirmed in that. And one thing I noticed is that until I learned to esteem myself and give myself permission to be who I am, as long as it's not a boundary violation, and until I learned to engage in active self-care, I was unable to allow anybody in relationship with me to be who they wanted to be when it didn't take care of me or didn't esteem me. See, those primary symptoms really deeply not only affect are about the relationship with self. Inevitably, if you've not managed them well, they will absolutely infect the relationship. In other words, if you don't self-love, you will not be able to love another human being and allow them to be who they are. If you don't have good boundaries, there's going to be a lot of offender issues going on in relationship. Whenever there's an offender issue, automatically there'll be a self-esteem problem and a power issue. Resentments, a lot of toxic energy. If you don't own your own reality, you have nothing to share in relationship, and your partner will experience you as empty and boring. If you don't actively self-care, then you are going to be a huge drag. You're going to be the kind of person in a relationship that hangs and whines like that. On the other hand, if you're anti-dependent, which is the other extreme in the illness, your partner will have the experience of not being important to the relationship. They'll be saying, why am I here? Nothing's happening in terms of me being able to give equal energy back into the relationship. This is all either I get or forget it. Sometimes it's I get nothing, I'm not to give anything too. So you have to have the ability to be in balance that way in relationship for it to work well. You have to be in active self-care and be available for interdependence, both in the taking and the giving. And you got to be moderate. One of the things I noticed in immature relationships, which again are human relationships, one of the things I noticed is that in an especially immature toxic relationship, there are huge intensity issues. In fact, intensity kind of defines the relationship. One of the unfortunate things about that is that oftentimes people, unfortunately, coming out of that experience, don't believe anything's happening unless there is intensity, and they seek to create it, when really, in relationships that are functional or mature, whatever you want to call that, I'm having a hard time labeling it, human and loving, there isn't a lot of intensity except where it's appropriate. And that would be when the circumstances call for some passionate activity, which can be sexual, or it can be a real important intellectual conversation. Or maybe at some point, maybe somebody's having some intense emotions. Like I was going through a grief reaction to some things in my life recently, and so I had a lot of intense grief emotions, mainly pain and some shame. And Pat was available to hear that, and it was rather intense, and he was very helpful to me. Offered a lot of physical support and an ear to listen, so that made it fairly intense. But I think in functional relationships, intensity isn't sought for intensity's sake. And when there is intensity, there are no victims. It's just about being human. So when I'm thinking about healthy relationships, I kind of do my thinking around the 5 core symptoms of codependence. Going down the secondary symptoms, what you'll see is people in healthy relationships don't engage in negative control or manipulation. They don't stand there and tell others how they have to be. And they don't manipulate others into who they want them to be. They let them be who they are a good deal of the time. It's not possible to do that all the time, because as human beings, of course, we're going to not be able to do that perfectly. You'll also see in relationships, I think, that are healthy, a lack of resentments, mainly because people are taking care of themselves and not making their partner responsible for their issues of self-care. And they use good boundaries. And don't mistake normal behavior for victimization. You know, when you've been injured early in life and have a lot of victim issues and have a lot of unfair experiences, whenever things seem to be unfair to you as an adult, you'll often think you're being victimized, when a lot of the times you're not being victimized, it's just what's happening. So you see, in mature relationships, both partners don't misinterpret victimization and develop resentments, and they stay out of offending each other, so there's no need to develop resentments. I think also, if a relationship is going to work well, there needs to be, at some level, absence of addictions, especially the ones that remove people from intimate exchange because they medicate reality so intensely. And those would be the big ones I talked about earlier on the recovery tape. And those would be chemical dependency, sex addiction, severe gambling issues, and severe eating disorders. When people are involved in those particular addiction issues, the addict is not available for intimate exchange, which is what creates the relationship. Love addiction can also be very destructive to a relationship too. And so I also include that as and avoidance. Those two are also issues of addiction that wind up being terribly destructive and creating very toxic exchange eventually, especially as the relationship ages. So I think it's important, if you want to have some sort of reasonable relationship with another person, that there's some sobriety. Now, another thing that I think is important to focus on, these are, I'm just telling you the things that I focus on, so I can find my way. I focus on what Aaron Beck said in his book, Love Is Never Enough. That's a very good book, by the way, if you want to read a good book on relationships. He's a father of cognitive therapy, and he's brilliant. The book's very intellectual, but it really gives you a lot of good information. But what he said was that there are 5 important concepts that have to be present in a relationship in our culture for the relationship to work in a reasonable way. One is there has to be commitment, because commitment brings about trust. Commitment means I'm going to be here through the thick and the thin of it. It doesn't mean I'm going to stay around and when it gets bad, I'm out of here. It means I am willing to go through this life experience with you, through the good and the bad of it. I'm committed to you, to working it out. Now, of course, I want to say something here too. Sometimes relationships are such that it would be a very unhealthy choice not to break the commitment. For example, when somebody's beating or sexually abusing another human being, or is threatening intense violence, or even to kill them all the time and stuff like this, the person really can't stay. In fact, I think the person doing the abusing has broken the commitment, destroyed it, as a matter of fact. But commitment is a huge issue. And what do we see in our culture today? People not able to commit. They have these, let's try this relationship for a while. What do they run into? They run into the difficulty all of us have dealing with other people's issues of humanity, and then they're out of there. People are afraid to commit because they think that in that commitment they're going to have some trouble. And of course, if you're going to be in a human relationship, aren't you going to have some trouble? Of course, it's inevitable. See, having relationships or being in relationships really requires a lot of heart, a lot of courage. And they'll make you. They will be your making. The second thing Beck talked about is that you have to have the ability to be faithful. And what's happened to our culture in the last 30 years around the issue of sexual fidelity? We've kind of confused ourselves over the issue. When you're sexual with somebody, for most people, there's a very deep bonding that goes on. When somebody steps outside a committed relationship and is unfaithful, and the partner finds out, the bond is broken. And sometimes I've noticed, even if the partner doesn't know, they sense a breaking of that bond. It's real funny. In my first relationship, my husband ran off with another woman. In another relationship I had, that one I didn't run off, but that was happening, and I could tell it without knowing. I had gone through the experience once. I knew what that experience was, and I knew it without knowing. So there must be fidelity. The third thing that must go on is loyalty, and this is a tricky issue. Pat and I went around and around and around and around about this one. But loyalty is about backing your partner up when they're in conflict with somebody else. You have to have that ability. Now, a lot of people, out of their logical mind, won't do it. Because what they say is, well, if my partner's wrong, I'm going to look like a jerk backing him up, and I won't do it. But if you don't do it, what's your partner going to think about you and the relationship? They will feel betrayed. Do you think that helps the relationship? No. The experience of betrayal is devastating. And what happens is that your partner's ability to trust you, if you are not loyal, will get on very shaky ground. And trust is the other important aspect that Beck talks about. You have to be trustworthy. In other words, you have to be who you say you are, as well as loyal and faithful. And you have to have the ability to trust. If your ability to trust has been wounded in childhood trauma, then your ability to be in relationship is on shaky grounds. What actually has to happen for somebody like that is they have to go through the experience of taking risks to the point that trust forms. But anyway, your partner's ability to trust you will be based on your ability to be loyal, faithful, and be who you say you are. Now, all that is necessary. I think in terms of loyalty, you have to, if your partner's in a fight with somebody else, the best you can do is stand behind them. If you think they're wrong, I would suggest you keep it to yourself unless they ask your opinion about it. And at least stand behind them. Don't get anywhere near the other person. Let your partner work it out, and let the other person be responsible for themselves. Don't get in the middle of it. It's very devastating. It'll be devastating most of the time to the relationship. Now, here's a glitch in our culture. What do you think happens when somebody's been divorced and remarried and there's his and her kids? Who are you loyal to? Your new partner or your children when your children get in honest conflict with your partner? Anybody have an answer for that? I haven't figured it out yet. It's like, do you want to hang yourself or shoot yourself? See, this divorce and remarriage and all these kids and all these half-siblings, full siblings, step-siblings, several different parents or grandparents, several different parents, several different moms, several different dads, stepmom, all this stuff, screws up the loyalty issue. Who are you going to be loyal to? Your kids aren't going to like it when you back up a new husband that they think is off the wall. They will feel betrayed. Now, if it's about your own parent, and I think children know, for the most part, that parents have to stand together. And as long as no direct abuse is going on to the child, that's pretty safe ground. A child will not wind up feeling so betrayed. It's still a risky area, too. What are we talking about? What am I talking about? Now, what does it sound like to you? What I'm talking about is how very difficult the human condition can be whenever we talk about relationships. I heard some new statistics. I can't remember the name of the study recently, but the study was showing, now again, I don't trust studies because I know people can manipulate statistics. But what it was seeing is that they believe children are less distressed when parents stay together than when they divorce in the long run. That was a chilling study. But having been divorced and remarried so that my children wind up having several mothers, several fathers, a whole array of siblings that are half and step and full and all this, uh, which I want to tell you is a nightmare when we all get together. The last time one of them got married, I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. And it mainly because it was so embarrassing, because a lot of, it was my daughter's wedding. She had a lot of her friends there. And they all wanted to know who these people were. And she was saying, well, now that's my father's daughter by his second marriage. And this is a step aunt. And this, because I've got 2 step siblings. I got 3 steps. But anyway, that's not here now. Anyway, now that's the mother of my father's second wife. And now that's the father of my mother's second husband. I mean, it was like, everybody's like, why don't we stop talking about this and these relationships? They're very complicated, and many times my children have said to me that they do not appreciate this experience. It makes it hard for them to know who to be loyal to, who to own, who to be close to, who to take risks with. So when I read that statistics, that study, I said to myself, aha, I understand this. Of course, as Pat said, hindsight looks like it's true, but it's not, because you never know if you had stayed what would have happened. It might have been worse. But you see, that again brings up the problems in our human relationships. We don't know. I assume that choice I made years ago to leave prevented something worse happening. But of course, what happened as a result of that certainly has created a lot of harmful consequences for all of us involved. And that was a hard decision to make. So there must be, going back over what I'm talking about, loyalty, fidelity, trust, commitment, and the last one, which is, for me, it's not as big as the others, but it's probably the harder thing to do, because it's murky for me. It's a little hard to understand exactly what it is. But he says one of the things you have to be able to do is be cooperative. You have to cooperate. In other words, you have to be able to negotiate and give in to a certain extent. Out of my immaturity issues, whenever I had to give in, at first I just gave in over everything because I was so afraid of abandonment. But later on, when I started to make a stand for myself and be true to myself, then I always felt like I lost something if I gave in at all. I mean, one extreme or the other. And I had to learn that sharing power and negotiating experiences and not getting my way was an act of maturity. And I had to reframe it in my whole head so I could get along with that. So as I'm on this journey in this relationship with my husband, I remember that stuff has to stay in place. The minute it's out of place, the relationship is rocky. Coupled with self-esteem, the ability to esteem and have good boundaries and take care of the self. So those are some of the things I think about to kind of keep myself ordered around this issue of relationship. Now I'm going to give you some other qualities that I think are present in healthy relationships. Qualities that came up to me when I was thinking about how to make sense out of a lecture like this. Some of it's similar, but it may help you understand the subject a little bit more deeply. One is that reality prevails. In other words, people work to tell the truth in the relationship. When I don't want to say something to Pat, I used to just not say anything and try to scoot through. Now I'll say to Pat, I don't want to talk about that, or I'm not going to discuss that subject. I'll let him know that is going on, and then I'll stand the vicissitudes of him trying to find out if he persists. Sometimes he doesn't want to know, especially if I look at him and say, if we persist in this, you will be sorry. He's learned to know that he probably will be, because I will probably lose control. I do know some things that I ought not to talk about. Power is shared and differences are negotiated. Here's another one. There's caring with detachment. That's hard. That is real hard if you're not taking good care of you. In other words, you stand back and let your partner have whatever consequences they're going to have. as a result of their choices. You have to remember your partner and other people, including your children, whoever, they are on their own journey. They're on their own path. That path is for them. They have their own consequences. Sometimes you really have to step back and let it happen. And at the same time, take active care of the self. That's real hard when you're watching something and you know you're going to get to suffer too. Right? That's part of the commitment. That's part of the bad of being with somebody. Limitations are accepted. Now, by the way, I'm saying this. Reality prevails, power is shared, caring or detachment. Let me add something to this. There's, for example, reality prevailing more of the time than less of the time. This isn't a 100% deal. Nobody can do all these things 100%. People are working towards, and it's happening more than it's happening less. Let me amend what I'm saying. Limitations are accepted as much as possible. In other words, all of us have limitations. I was trying to think of one of mine. I've got many, but one that I'm willing to talk about. Gosh, nothing's come. I could do Pat's inventory about his limitations really easily. I was trying to think. I have some limitations around orderliness. I really have to have things in some sort of order in order to think. That can really get in Pat's way because he doesn't need the kind of order I need, and I wind up putting things away that he doesn't want put away because he can never find it again, that sort of thing. Now, because he can't find things when they're put away, and I can only find things when they're put away. Now, that's his limitation and my limitation, and what we've learned to do is accept that each is working that way, and we work at being cooperative within the limitations each of us have. So if you went in our house today, an example would be half the bed's made, mine, half of it isn't, his. I don't like to cook. I was a slave to cooking for many years and grew to absolutely hate it. I'm not able to find it a creative experience. Pat loves to cook. Absolutely loves to get in there. So he cooks, and guess what I do, which he does not do well? I clean up, and I'm happy to clean up. If I asked him to clean up, it wouldn't be cleaned up. If he asked me to cook, he probably wouldn't like it. So we are able to accept those limitations instead of getting into this, I have to have a partner that's orderly, or I have to have a partner that will cook, this sort of thing. We accept our limitations. There's many other limitations we have. For example, my husband likes old cars that stink and rumble around. I hate that kind of thing. So we have 2 cars. We cooperate. Sometimes I can't ride in his, and I go to Phoenix all by myself with him driving behind me because he doesn't want to ride in my car. We support each other's efforts at self-care, and we take responsibility for our own issues of self-care. We're really eccentric. On my license plate, did any of you notice what I have on there? My next husband's going to be normal. I think that he's eccentric. Now, he looks at me and he thinks I'm eccentric. My next husband's going to be normal. Do you know I've had people leap out of the parking lot, grab my door and open it and ask me where I got that thing? I was driving out of Revco, backing out of Revco the other day, and these people were standing in front of my car just bending over, laughing, and I noticed it because I'd seen them in Revco. And I just happened to notice the 2 couples, and so I looked up and, there's a couple, and and then they're looking, and they were laughing, bending over, and finally one of them pointed at my license plate because her husband hadn't seen it, and she was dragging him over, going, and I knew what she was doing, telling him how eccentric he is, and loving the experience. At a car wash in Phoenix. I'll get you one if you want one. I've gotten about 4 of them. In fact, I kept a stack in my trunk. Because people stopped me and wanted to know, and I was just giving to the universe. They cost $1. I just said, here you are, and it was all women. All women. Last thing is that people have realistic expectations. for their partners and what they're going to get out of the relationship. You're going to get both the good and the bad. And you're going to get, what you're going to get are the wonderful things from your partner and the things that aren't so wonderful. My husband has, well, he's been an absolute challenge, believe me. And I know I've been a challenge to him. But I tell you, my husband has been the wind beneath my wings. And that's been pretty important to me. So I take the good and the bad in this relationship. And I actually, some of these things that I used to call bad, I never call bad anymore. I just call it my husband or my sons or my daughter or my son-in-law or whatever it is, just being who they are. And I've learned, as long as it's not a boundary violation to me, I can accept it. Okay? Last thing, there's a couple of other things I want to say in that. Usually you'll see in healthy relationships or ones that are working, people do mental inventories on the positive aspects of the relationships and remember those. As human beings, we usually only note what's distressing us. We don't know what's working. In other words, like for example, Pat and I have an issue about shutting doors, cupboard doors and drawers. I shut them so junk doesn't get in. He never shuts them. If he's been in the kitchen, everything is open, all the drawers are open, and all that sort of thing. And I confronted him one day. I said, I just can't stand this. Could you please start shutting? He said, I'll try. Well, he did it very well, but I never noticed. And later on, he left it open once. And I said, you left it open? He said, I've been shutting it for 3 months. You've never noticed that it was shut. You only noticed that it was open, which I just got all screwed up over. And I finally realized what he was saying. And I began to make mental inventories on the things that were working well. It helps sustain the relationship and not just focus on the negative. And I think in healthy relationships, again, there's nonviolence. And people make conscious choices about what to fight about. So in closing with this, as you know, if you've ever read anything I've written or listened to anything I've talked about or anything, you know that my life has not been easy. And my partnership with my husband has not been easy either, but it's been totally worth it. I've learned these things and I do these things that I've been talking about. Totally worth it because it's really, like I think I said in an earlier lecture, my children became my making. Remember I told you I was so damaged I couldn't do it for me and I learned to do it for them. My husband has been my making. Not that he's responsible for that or that I couldn't have done it without him, but in relationship, not only with our children, but in relationship with our partners, they teach us many things. And the biggest thing they're teaching us is to love. Never forget that. And with that, I'm going to close this lecture. Thank you very much.